YouTube, this is RL coming to you again from my channel, and welcome back to a new podcast called Retro Faceoff, where we'll be facing off retro arcade classics from different eras. This era is going to be, I guess, late 70s, early 80s.
That sounds about right. Yep.
I'm going to be Team Pac Man, and you are Team Space Invaders. Alright, so do you want to give a brief description of what we're doing in this podcast?
Sure. Yeah, so basically we're pitting two teams as in games, head-to-head for ultimate dominance. The games chosen will be scored like we normally do in our review, where I guess now I'm doing the thing. No? Graphics,
yes,
sound effects, sex appeal, gameplay.
There's no sex appeal. I don't see sex appeal. Where did sex appeal come from? My notes are different than your notes, CK. Well, that's an interesting concept. Maybe we'll call up another category for that. But it's going to be graphics, sound effects, gameplay, controls, difficulty, fun factor, and replay value. Sorry, guys, no sex appeal.
No sex appeal.
Don't leave the channel. I'm sure we'll have some fun content to make up for the lack of sex appeal.
And if you're interested in sex appeal in games, please place in the comments below.
We could actually have a retro face-off of sex appeal games from the arcade era. I like that. Let's do that today, CK.
let's get on with this one, and maybe we'll put that on the back burner.
Forget about Space Invaders and Pac Man. Anyways, so you'll start off with graphics for Space Invaders, and then I will do graphics for Pac Man, and back and forth.
All right,
and see what the score is.
Yep.
So let's start off with Space Invaders graphics. What do you think of the graphics for Space Invaders, CK?
The graphics for Space Invaders are, like a lot of games back then, super simple. Black back screen, colored pixels. It's simple. What I did like about Space Invaders is that, you know, it had the color variations, and the colors really popped off the black screen. Anyone who knows these classic games like Pac Man, like Space Invaders, they were, you know, they were ahead of their time during the time. 1978, 1979, 1980s. These were huge, and arcade machines were super popular. I think the graphics are good for that generation, as per what other games had that time. And with the little details on each of the individual guys, they really actually made it more unique than just blocks or blobs or generic shapes. And for that, I give it a retro double like.
Double like. Alright, so I'm going to pit it against graphics for Pac Man for me. Yeah, very basic graphics, very iconic for its time. Graphics back then, you know, arcades were very simplistic in nature. It's classic. What can I say? You know, it's so simple colors, and eating of those pebbles and Pac-Man dots and all that stuff was very iconic and fun. So I'm going to give it a retro double like as well. Alright, so what do you think of the sound effects in Space Invaders, CK?
Basic. The sound effects were pretty basic, like a lot of those games, bleeps and bloops, man. Or I mean, certain games had really cool explosion sounds and so on and so forth. I don't think Space Invaders really did, but it did have for every descent, it had its own sound that may have been only on consoles, maybe it was only arcades, but I do remember them having unique sounds for each thing on the screen. Now, you know, they were limited, but that's just what it was back then. And because I enjoyed it, and it was distinguishable if you just heard the game being played, you more than likely can identify Space Invaders, I give it a retro double like.
Ooh, double like. Alright, sound effects for Pac Man for me. You know, it is, I'm going to say iconic a lot.
It is.
It's very iconic. It's just the forerunner for sound effects. You know, with whoop, 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 you know, and just sounds that are just so, you know automatically when you hear them, it's Pac Man, and it revolutionized. I don't know if sound effects really meant as much before Pac Man came out, and really identified sounds for each thing that goes on. You know, the bigger power-ups, the chomping of those dots, right? Yep. And the sound of the ghosts, and it's iconic. And I'm gonna give it a retro love for sound effects because it was the granddaddy of sound. It introduced sound effects to the audience of the early 80s. Alright, so we're moving on, going lightning fast here to gameplay for Space Invaders.
Space Invaders gameplay was unique for that format. I mean, it's probably been used many times. And now that I think about it, a lot of those games, a lot of the older games, really did stick to a unique type of format. You know, Frogger had its own mechanism, Space Invaders had its own mechanism, Galaga has its own mechanism, Pac Man had its own mechanism, and no one really kind of copied the other with just a different skinning of a game, like how games are now. That being said, again, you know, Space Invaders, just like Pac Man, is iconic in its form and in its function. You know, you do have an army of alien pixels descending upon you, and you have a laser that requires you to actually hit an object before you can reload. It makes it challenging, and it truly does push the hand-eye coordination, I think, more so than a lot of other games back in that time, including Pac Man. And for that, I give it a retro love.
Oh, retro love for gameplay. Yeah, it's all about the gameplay. Really, it is all about the gameplay. So, yeah, for Pac Man against Space Invaders, I want to make it more competition-y. I haven't really done that. So, I'm just going to say Pac Man rules and Space Invaders sucks. Yeah, gameplay for Pac Man is just, I'm going to say it, iconic. You know, it's so simple. Moving around a maze, avoiding those ghosts, and chomping on those dots. It's just basically a pizza eating, you know, a reverse eating thing, you know. Originally, Pac Man was a pizza. It's really very fun gameplay. It wasn't, at that time period, it wasn't about graphics, it wasn't about sound, it wasn't about story, obviously. It was about gameplay, and that's the granddaddy of gameplay. So it gets a retro double love for gameplay.
Double love. Good score.
All about the gameplay. It started the gameplay era. It's so addictive, and the gameplay is pitch perfect. Alright, moving on to controls for Space Invaders.
It's one of those games that, like I kind of said earlier with regards to the gameplay, it requires that hand-eye coordination. And really, it's just a game where you do move left and right. The game itself doesn't have the variety that some of the other games in this generation had. And I think that's where, you know, it unfortunately will fall back in score compared to most games in this category. The left and right really just sums up almost like a Pong mechanism, if you think about it. And, you know, Pong being the great granddaddy of retro.
Yes.
It does, in its simplicity, execute a challenge for players with its hand-eye, and that's where it gets made up. So, unfortunately for Space Invaders, controls take a bit of a dive and get a retro half-like.
Harsh. And I mean, people are probably thinking, well, this is a competition. Shouldn't you want to make yours win over Pac Man? But we don't know what's going to be a high or a low score. You know, we don't know which is going to win, right? So it's just like any other time. We're just scoring it the way we want to score it.
Exactly. We're going to score it as honestly biased as possible.
So, controls for Pac Man, you know, left, right, up and down. It's very simple, effective but simple. Yeah. I'm just not going to beat around the bush. There's not much to say. It's straightforward. I'm going to give it a double like.
Okay, that's still a fairly decent score.
Yeah, all my scores are really decent, except... Alright, so let's moving on really quickly here. What do you think of difficulty for the Space Invaders? Your Space Invaders game.
Space Invaders is a difficult enough game as you get further along. The difficulty ramps up in this with every level, and it's the speed that truly is kind of the crushing blow for most players. Having the little guards in front of you when you're playing at the beginning of the game versus when you don't have those guards any longer. And you think about it, I've only been thinking about the hero, but I mean, these aliens are also, you know, sitting there and making their way down the screen at speeds that make it tough. And as you get further along, this is a game that doesn't really have an end. I don't think it actually has an end. You just play it as far as you can and score as much as you can. So the difficulty for me is actually pretty awesome. And because of that, I ramp it up to a double retro love.
Oh, wow. Look at that. A double retro love.
Never-ending challenge, my friend.
So difficulty for Pac Man for me, it's pretty much similar. It never really ends. There is a glitch at the 256 mark, I believe, level 256. They even made a remake of that and made a glitch in the game, kind of Pac Man, where you're always going up and then you gotta avoid the glitch. But we're not talking about that game, although I really like that game. Difficulty is difficulty. I mean, you get as far as you can get. It gets harder and faster, and the time in which you could get those ghosts gets lower, shorter. Exactly. So it's your own skill set will take you as far as you can get. It's only frustrating as far as your own skill set. If you just don't have skill to play these games, it's going to be frustrating. So I'm going to give it a love for difficulty.
Definitely.
All right, so moving on. Fun factor for Space Invaders. What do you give it, CK?
Fun factor for me comes with the challenge in Space Invaders. I think for a lot of people, the challenge is really where the fun is, because graphically it doesn't really do anything. Control-wise, left and right, and shoot. But it's the timing, it's the hand-eye coordination, and those are the things that really matter. I'm feeling a little middle of the road type situation here for this, because as much as I love it, I know that it's really not that fun and as a game in general, and it gets a retro like for me.
A retro like for fun factor. Alright, so Pac Man. Fun factor for Pac Man, as I'm Team Pac Man, if you didn't know already. It's obviously a classic. It's been around forever. It's fun, but it's not super exciting fun. It is what it is. Trying to think back to maybe the days when it came out and just the enjoyment of it when it was new and fresh would have been a lot more fun at that time period. Nowadays, how fun is it? Really hard to gauge,
Yeah.
I mean, we're trying to gauge it from that perspective of that time period. But let's be honest, it's not easy to do because it's a very simple game. There's a lot of fun to it. I'm going to give it a retro double like for fun.
All
right. Replay value, CK. What do you think the replay value is for Space Invaders?
There's a high replay value for the player that seeks a challenge. By no means, again, we're talking about how entertaining the game is in itself. And entertainment comes from the challenge itself. There's, I think a lot of the games can be said, a lot of this can be said about the games within this generation. I'd replay Space Invaders. I enjoy it up to a degree. It gets frustrating to a point and then you probably want to put it down. It kind of fits right in there with the mobile games that are kind of out now, with the little tapper games and stuff like that. It just keeps you busy, the busybody games. And because it does fit in that category, and I find that to me is enjoyable, but not to a huge degree, it gets a retro like from me.
Yeah, middle ground of enjoyment, I mean, it's not gonna blow your top off. So replay value for Pac Man for me, it's a game, as I say, I pick it up once in a while if I'm in the mood for an old school kind of game. I feel it's got a middle ground replay value. It's nothing, it's not going to make me play it over and over. I'll play it maybe once, see how far I can get, but honestly, I'm not going to be very, I'm not going to give it a high score. I'm just going to give it a retro like for replay value. Alright, so this is where we talk about the influence of these two games. So you talk first about the influence of Space Invaders, and I'll go next.
So, for Space Invaders and its influence, just speaking on a lot of games in this generation, a lot of them did. And a lot of games were built off of this. And I think even to this day, especially in the mobile game space, that left to right, shoot up and shoot down, every console had a game that did that. Every console up until now. Every mobile game in some genre of kind of, busybody games and even new ones. Space Invaders and its mechanic in general is massive. And because of that, I give it an influence of 2.
The highest score for influence. So Pac Man influence for me, I think Pac Man was hugely influenced in that early 80s period. There were so many games that came out that was using that maze, structure for a game, because games are very simple back then. So they just copied what they knew was going to sell, and there was tons of these types of games, and it did revolutionize the industry for its time. So I gotta give it a score of 2 as well. Alright, so the loser score, the person who gets the low score will now flip. So you get the flip, CK.
Alright, we got 29. Losing team, and I'm going to flip. Here we go. And that's on the floor. And it is heads. And Team Pac Man takes the win.
What do I win, CK? We didn't discuss that.
You win a complimentary Insert object of value here.
Can I forfeit this win, CK? What I win, I actually get to choose the next era for the next retro face-off. And I choose... Dun, dun, dun.
Sure.
I'm going to choose the 1990s era for arcades.
All right. Get ready for a challenge. I got a few of them in the 90s.
All right, well, that was a lot of fun, CK. Our first retro face-off. How did you find it?
It was neat. I believe we've got a pretty solid system here, and it ties in well because it's familiar with our other podcast. If you guys haven't visited, jump back into the channel and check out Retro Life Reviews.
And on that note, we will have more retro content in the weeks, months, and years to come. Bye for now.
Ciao, folks.